Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Our next speaker is James Guest, also from Newcastle University. James currently holds a European Research Council grant, building his own world-class research team at Newcastle University, which will focus on challenges facing tropical coral reefs. He's done considerable research work around reef restoration globally. For example, in 2016-17, he was a fellow at the University of Hawaii's Institute of Marine Biology, investigating methods of identifying resilient coral reefs. James is also a keen diver. He has been since he was 17, and he said that that has partly informed his decision to become a marine biologist. And you said you wanted to use this?
I think I'll just use the microphone here. That might be a little bit easier. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Selena, for introducing this and to sort of hopefully whetting your appetite to want to know more about coral reefs and why they're exciting and why they're interesting. So for the next sort of 20 minutes, what I want to sort of talk about 4 things related to coral reefs. Firstly, I want to define what they are, what a coral is, how it lives and how it forms a reef and what a reef is. I want to say a little bit about why I think reefs are important. Selena touched on this already, but to introduce why they're very important. I also want to talk a little bit about what the threats are to reefs. Why should we be really concerned about their future? And finally, sort of talk about some of the things that people are starting to do to help to preserve reefs and help to conserve them into the future. So to start with, what is a coral? Some of you may have seen them. You may have been snorkeling on reefs or diving on reefs and may have seen corals. We brought along a few examples this evening. There's some coral skeletons on the table, which you can have a look at in the break. And you'll see that those have various different forms. Some look like, some are branching. Some look a bit like sort of lettuce leaves. Others are like little boulders. But they're all corals. They're all different types and forms of corals. And these are the skeletons. So these are actually dead corals. So the biological tissue that used to cover them has gone. But if you saw those on the reef, they would essentially look the same as that. The only difference is that they would have a layer of tissue over the top and they would have color. They'd be brown and red and green and sometimes purple and some amazing colors. But those are essentially what the corals are. And the coral animal itself is a really, really fascinating animal. It's really simple. It's made up of 2 cell layers, and in between those 2 cell layers is a layer of jelly that sort of sticks them together. They don't have any organs, so they don't have a heart or a lungs or anything else. They have a very basic mouth and a stomach. They have tentacles. They have stinging cells that they use to capture food. They can reproduce, because they're animals, they reproduce sexually. So they produce eggs and sperm. They actually reproduce by throwing all of their eggs into the water and throwing their sperm into the water, and the eggs and sperm meet in the sea, fertilize externally. When they fertilize, they produce a little larvae, a tiny sort of 1 millimeter long larvae that swims around and gets carried by the currents. Sometimes they can be carried for tens or hundreds of kilometers, and then they'll find a hard bit of substrate, a hard bit of reef to settle on, and then they settle and they attach. And then that single larvae will form what we call a polyp. And a polyp is the sort of initial unit, as it were, of a coral. And once that settles and forms this single polyp, it will start to sort of bud off little daughter polyps, and those daughter polyps go to form a coral colony. And corals are kind of, one of the things that I find really interesting about corals is that they're what we call modular organisms. So they have 2 levels of organization. They have 2 levels of being an individual, if you like. So all of us in this room, we're all unitary organisms. We are one individual. We don't have sort of multiple versions of ourselves. With a coral, it has these 2 levels. So what you see on the table there, these are coral colonies, but they're actually made up of lots and lots and lots of individual polyps, which are all essentially identical and joined together to form this colony. So from the point of view of a biologist, it's sometimes really, really interesting to study these, because you kind of want to understand at what level are you studying it at. Do you study it at the level of the polyp or at the level of the colony? Well, in fact, both are really, really important. What you can do with a coral colony like this is you could break off or cut off a single polyp if you wanted to, or a little branch, and you could glue it down onto a piece of plastic or a piece of rock or something, keep it in an aquarium or put it into the sea, and then that would grow into a whole new coral colony again. And in fact, that's exactly what happens in nature. Often the coral colonies themselves get broken, pieces break off. If they survive, if they get wedged into a piece of rock, that can grow into a new coral colony. So what can happen on a reef is you can actually get coral colonies which are very, very, very old. They can be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. And in fact, in theory, the sort of actual genetic individual could be thousands or tens of thousands of years old, theoretically, because if you imagine you get one coral settling, growing into a colony, bits of it break off and form new colonies. The original colony might completely die, the original tissue might be all dead, but the sort of genetic individual could potentially last for hundreds or thousands of years. So they're sort of like potentially immortal organisms, which I think is quite cool. I think the other thing about sort of coral colonies, I've made a couple of references to sort of books in this talk, because we're in a bookshop, and in the break you'll go and have a look at the bookshop. And one of the quotes that I found, I'm going to have to read this out from here and stay looking at the microphone, but there's a wonderful quote from Karl Marx, who used corals as a sort of analogy for cooperation in society. And I really like this quote, and I hope I'm going to read it like this. So he said, "We see mighty coral reefs rising from the depths of the ocean into islands and onto firm land, yet each individual depositor is puny, weak, and contemptible." And I think that's I sort of agree with the first part, but not the second part. I don't think corals are contemptible at all. But what he was trying to say is that you've got these small, very simple individuals that do this remarkable thing. And the remarkable thing that they do is build reefs, these huge geological structures. Sometimes these geological structures form entire nations. So nations like the Maldives, in the Indian Ocean, for example, is essentially built on top of coral reefs. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia is I think, considered the only sort of geological structure of biological origin that can be seen from space. And all of those structures, those geological structures, are built by these tiny little animals. So for considering they're very simple organisms, they do sort of really remarkable things. And they do that by laying down these sort of skeletons that you see here, and they do it very slowly. Those skeletons will build up, the coral will die, they accrete together, they sort of get glued together by algae and other things. And when they die, a new coral will settle on top of them, and then that process will continue to happen. And over thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, you can build up a geological structure called a reef. One of the other sort of book references that I wanted to bring into this was a book by Charles Darwin. So most people know Darwin as being the author of Origin of Species, and that's what he's most famous for. But about a decade or so before that, he published a book about coral reefs. And it's actually, his book about coral reefs is considered to be one of the sort of really most incredible sort of pieces of scientific work, because what he did was, when he was going around the world on the Beagle, he started to look at the structure of coral reefs, and he figured out a theory of how a reef formed. And that's pretty incredible, because this is the first time he had seen these. He was just seeing them from the surface. He wasn't obviously not scuba diving. He didn't necessarily know a huge amount about coral biology, and he didn't have the means to sort of look at the geological structure of a reef, as in being able to drill down inside a reef and see what it was made of. But he figured out that essentially many reefs get formed by corals settling onto an island, forming the beginnings of a reef. And then what can happen is that island can start to subside, it starts to sink, and then that can form a barrier reef, because the coral reef keeps up, it keeps growing, and it stays close to the surface. And then that island can continue to sink and drop below the surface. And providing the corals could sort of keep up, they can form what we call an atoll, which is these sort of rings that you see. You've seen pictures of these from the Pacific and so on. And what's amazing about that is he's turned out to be almost completely 100% right, despite the fact that he didn't really have the tools to prove his theory. And it was only 100 years later, and there was much debate about whether he was correct or not. It was 100 years later, and when they started doing nuclear tests in the Pacific, that they could drill down through a reef, and they drilled down over 1,000 meters. And what they wanted to show, and this is what Darwin said, he said, well, to prove my theory, you have to do this, is drill all the way down, and you have to keep going and keep going and keep going and find nothing but coral skeletons, and then eventually find volcanic rock. And that's what they did, and they had to drill down over 1,000 meters and found nothing but coral. And then they finally found volcanic rock, and they could look at what the coral skeletons were, just above the volcanic rock, and they could show that those were shallow water individuals. So they must have started when that volcano was at the surface and then it had sunk. So that's kind of my book reference, and I think if you ever get a chance to look through Darwin's stuff, then I would suggest have a look at his Coral Reefs book, because it's a fascinating piece of science. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was a bit about why reefs are important. I'm only going to touch on this because Selena's already talked about this a lot, but this is why, we get, as scientists who study reefs, we on the one hand we have a fantastic job. We get to sort of do our hobby as a job, really, and we get to go and see these reefs on a reasonably regular basis, and it's really exciting. On the other hand, it can be really depressing, because what we're seeing is the system that we love and the system that we study is declining massively. And so why should we be concerned about that, especially living in the UK, living in the northeast of England, where there are no tropical coral reefs? And one of the main reasons, well, there's two sort of reasons, really. Firstly, they're worth an enormous amount. Now, of course, they're mostly worth an enormous amount to people who live in tropical countries, but, the Earth is a small place. The borders that we have are really borders that we have drawn. And when you start to sort of have a huge economic effect on one area as a result of losing a really important ecosystem, that's going to trickle down to everywhere else in the rest of the world. So we need to be concerned, of course, about all the ecosystems for that reason. But coral reefs are, really incredibly valuable. They have sort of one of the highest sort of economic values per unit area of any ecosystem in the world. The estimates are really hard to get, but one estimate is about $350,000 per hectare per year in terms of ecosystem goods and services. So a hectare is about just say a football pitch is about 2/3 of a hectare. So you can sort of imagine that's quite a sort of high value for that small area. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, is estimated to contribute about $6 billion to the economy through tourism and fisheries and so on. So they're sort of hugely valuable. And of course, they're incredibly diverse. So again, it's one of the most species-rich marine ecosystems on the planet. But it occupies this sort of really small area of the ocean, so it's less than sort of 0.1% of the total ocean area, but all these species are kind of crammed into that area. And we're now entering a sort of a new, what we now think is a new geological epoch, and people have given it a name. We're entering what we call the Anthropocene, and geologists, I don't know if it's actually been officially accepted now, but I think most scientists do accept that we've entered a sort of sixth extinction event, where we're losing species so rapidly that it's way higher than the normal background level of species loss, and that's because of human activities. So it's of great concern. What are the sort of threats that we are seeing on reefs, and what's causing this decline? Well, there are many, and Selena touched on some of them. For example, overfishing is huge, coastal land pollution, predators that have sort of seemed to have bloomed. We've had massive disease events that have knocked out, huge numbers of corals in the Caribbean, for example. There was one disease event that in about the 1970s killed almost all of the main framework reef building coral in the Caribbean. It was two species essentially that did most of the reef building, and they got wiped out in the space of a decade or so. And then some of them are slowly coming back now, and so on. But that was a sort of a huge shift and change to Caribbean reefs. So there's sort of all these sort of threats. The main one that people are really concerned about now is climate change. And the reason for that is, well, there are sort of two main reasons. One is that the oceans are getting warmer. Corals tend to sort of live very close to their upper threshold for temperature. And when it goes a little bit above that threshold, as is happening pretty much now, it's getting to the point where it's happening every few years, every 2 or 3 years, the corals go through this thing called coral bleaching. And that's when they lose an important symbiont that occurs in their tissue. And corals are, another thing that's really interesting about them is that they're not just a single animal organism. They contain a plant. So they have a plant cell inside their tissues that photosynthesizes and passes on the energy to the coral. And the problem with that is a really nice symbiotic relationship. It's beautiful. It's what allows reefs to sort of form. The problem is it's a kind of a really difficult relationship whereby if things get a little bit stressful and problematic, then the algae tend to leave or they tend to sort of degrade very, very quickly. And that results in these bleaching events. And the bleaching means that the reef turns white, essentially, because the corals lose their pigmentation. And if that extends for any sort of period of time, the corals lose their source of energy, and then they die en masse. So this has been happening with increasing frequency, so people are really, really very concerned about it. Just for example, on the Great Barrier Reef in the last 2 to 3 years, I'm sure some of you saw the news about this, they had these back-to-back bleaching events, which were really, they predicted the first one, but they didn't sort of predict the second one, and now there's concern there'll be a third one this year. And they've lost huge numbers of corals. And again, it's quite hard to estimate the exact numbers, but I think something like about half the reef has been affected, and they maybe lost sort of 30 to 40% of the corals on the reef. So that's, incredibly worrying that that's happened in a couple of years. So I'm going to finish off in the last couple of minutes about some of the things that, hopefully with perhaps a little hint of optimism of what can be done. And there's huge efforts to try and sort of conserve reefs and to try to make sure that there are some reefs left in the next 10, 20, 30 years and so on. One of the main ways, and probably the most important, is to actually protect areas. And marine protected areas have sprung up all around the world. And they are problematic, as Selena sort of pointed out, because lots of people are using the reefs, and if you protect them and prevent people from fishing, then that has a knock-on effect on local economies. But it's recognized that we probably need a lot more marine protected areas. And so there have been some really positive things that have happened. For example, in the last year of Obama's presidency, he set up, I think, what's considered the biggest marine park in the world. I don't know if has changed since then, but it's a marine park in Hawaii. I actually learned it's a really difficult name to say. Hawaiian words are very difficult, but it's the Papahana Moku Akea Marine National Monument. Okay, so that's the area of that is something like twice the size of Texas. It's about 1.5 million square kilometers. So it's absolutely huge. And that was a sort of a really massive thing to do to protect an area like that. So those are sort of some of the positive signs. The problem, of course, though, is that marine protected areas are not immune to the effects of climate change. Climate change is affecting everywhere. And in fact, some of these isolated areas that haven't had human influence tend to be quite vulnerable to increases in temperature. So on the Great Barrier Reef in the last couple of years, with the bleaching events that they experienced, they found there was really no difference between protected areas and non-protected areas in terms of how well they dealt with the bleaching event. So protecting areas isn't going to protect them from big changes in temperature. And that's a real concern. So the only thing really that we can do to ensure that coral reefs survive into the future is to reduce carbon emissions. And that's not something that you and I can do sitting here. It's something that has to happen at a government and at a global level. And of course, there have been some positive signs that could happen with the Paris Agreement, but there have been some recent quite negative signs, which I'm not going to go into. But I think you know what I'm talking about. So that's the real concern. I mean, essentially, there's lots of things that we can do, but if we don't deal with carbon emissions and if we don't deal with man-made climate change, then reefs eventually are not going to survive. The very last point is that there are some other positive and interesting things in that we've started to find that some corals are actually a little bit better at adapting and acclimatizing to changes than we thought. And there was a point in time where people felt that actually corals had sort of exhausted their capacity to adapt, we'd reached all of their limits. And actually we found that that's not true at all. They're often a lot tougher than we give them credit for. And we found in areas that when they've already gone through a major bleaching event, and then 5 to 10 years later, another warming event happens, we find that in some places the corals actually do a lot better than they did in the previous event. And that suggests either they've acclimatized a bit, or there's been adaptation, there's actually been natural selection. The weakest ones have been weeded out, and what's left are ones that can tolerate slightly higher temperatures. So that's really important. And the last sort of thing I would say, when this sort of leads into the project that I'm doing at Newcastle University with several other colleagues, is we're looking to see if we can sort of harness that. So, going and finding individual corals that tend to be a bit tougher, tend to be able to deal with higher temperatures. And one of the things that I've been doing for quite a number of years is breeding corals, so taking them, letting them spawn, and crossing the eggs and the sperm. So what we're interested to do is see if we can find these tougher individuals. Can we cross the eggs and sperm in tanks, so we can do it all on land, so we get most of them to survive, and then put those back onto the reef and see if we can increase the frequency of those on the reefs, and seeing if that will allow those reefs to tolerate higher temperatures in the future. Now, it's incredibly ambitious, and we want to sort of approach it from a scientific, pragmatic point of view and find out what's actually possible and how much it would cost and so on. But several groups, research groups in the world, are looking to this now and looking to see what's possible through human-assisted evolution or assisted gene flow on reefs. And so hopefully in the next sort of 4 to 5 years, we'll have some exciting results from that, and maybe I can come back here and give another talk. Thank you.